Welcome to the 237th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with author Radha Vatsal, author of the historical mystery novel, A Front Page Affair. Stay tuned for the interview. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Radha Vatsal, author of the new historical mystery novel, A Front Page Affair. Radha, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Well, can you read 2 or 3 pages from your new novel, A Front Page Affair?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So just a little background. A Front Page Affair is set in New York City in 1915, and the protagonist is Capability, or as she's known, Kitty Weeks. And she works for the ladies' page of a newspaper, the New York Sentinel. Back in 1915, women were sort of relegated to specialized departments of newspapers. They weren't allowed to report general news because it was felt that they couldn't stand the strain of working under deadlines or going out and about the way that men could. And so the section I'm going to read to you, so what happens is that Kitty is sent to cover a July 4th party at which one of the guests is murdered. And she returns back to the paper, and one of the male reporters from the news desks asks her to assist with covering the story. And also just a little bit of background on the period is that the U.S. is still neutral. It hasn't yet joined World War I, although that's going on in Europe. The Lusitania has just been sunk. And also there's this attack on J.P. Morgan's mansion, but that on J.P. Morgan at home, his mansion, although I guess that doesn't appear in this section that I'm reading. This is a conversation between Kitty and the male reporter.
Great.
Let me get the page. Do the police have any leads, Mr. Flanagan? Kitty leaned across the metal table. That's not for you to worry about. Flanagan rubbed the fleshy pads of his fingers together. What I need from you is texture, details about the evening, who came, what was said, emotional reactions and such. How did the guests respond when they heard the news? How did the police handle matters? The feminine viewpoint on things. Ah, yes, I see, the woman's angle. Kitty swallowed her disappointment. Well, don't tell me. Write it down. Write it down, he repeated. Yes, Mr. Flanagan. And have you conducted an interview before? Ah, Kitty wasn't about to draw attention to the fact that the first time she actually spoke to anyone on official Sentinel business had been yesterday at the party. Tell me, how does one go about it? Flanagan didn't notice her hesitation. An interview, Kitty began, is a journalistic form, first attempted on this side of the Atlantic. I'm not asking what, Miss Weeks, I am asking how. Please, answer the question precisely. Yes, Mr. Flanagan. Kitty quoted from Schumann's Practical Journalism. The reporter meets his man, has a talk with him on the subjects desired, and instead of taking a faithful record of every word, watches to catch the spirit of what is said and the manner in which it is uttered. He jots down the speaker's exact words only on vital or technical points. Exactly, Flanagan murmured. With his materials mostly in his head, he goes to his desk and writes the interview. Half of the words credited to the speaker may not in fact have been uttered by him, yet if the work is well done, it will be more just and infinitely more readable than any dialogue reproduced verbatim. That's correct. Flanagan ran a hand through his leonine mane. The most difficult part of the task is getting the subject to talk, Kitty continued. You must remember what he has said while keeping up your side of the conversation and keeping in mind the questions that remain. All right, Miss Weeks, I see you know your stuff. Now all that remains is for us is to see if you can do as you say. Kitty's heart raced. So you'd like me to speak to a few of the guests And have my report for you by this afternoon. Her eyes opened wide. Flanagan groaned. This is real news, Miss Weeks, not your ladies' page stuff. We have hard deadlines. He relented. All right, since you're new to it, you can give me the third report tomorrow. Hand in your notes on the other two by 3 o'clock today. He pushed back the bench. You're familiar with the term sob sisters? Yes, Mr. Flanagan. They're the 4 lady reporters who covered the trial of Harry Thaw for murdering Sanford White back in '07. Kitty knew their names. Miss Greeley-Smith, Miss Dix, Miss Patterson, and Miss Black. Isn't Mr. Thaw to have another trial soon? I believe so, but that isn't my point. What I want to bring to your attention is the type of writing that those females produced. They did your kind a great disservice by splashing their personal opinions on every line. They turned out page after page of purple prose that made me sick to my stomach. Not that you will be writing anything other than notes, but you cannot forget. He slowed down. The Sentinel does not tolerate that kind of garbage. While you're working for me, you keep it simple, keep it dignified, and keep to the facts. Can you manage that? Absolutely, Mr. Flanagan. Kitty had no intention of doing anything else.
Great. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about A Front Page Affair yet, how would you describe your debut novel?
I think I would say that it's a coming-of-age story, both for the protagonist, Kitty, and also it's a coming-of-age story for the U.S. I've sort of envisioned, this is the first in a series which I've envisioned as going across the whole World War I era, but from a domestic perspective. And what happens during this time, it's a very exciting time for women. Women enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and by 1920, they get the vote. But they're becoming more and more vocal. They're being more present in public life. At the same time, the U.S. goes from being a second-tier nation, on the other side of the Atlantic, to really, by the end of 1920, becoming the leading player on the world stage. It becomes, a dominant international economic power, political power, and cultural power. Movies from Hollywood are all the rage, cars are all the rage, and that's all American. So it's really like, I see it as a mystery, but also a coming-of-age story with a very strong historical grounding. So, for instance, from what I quoted for, the passage that I read from you when Kitty talks about Schumann's practical journalism, for instance, that is exactly how people reported back then. News interviews were new. They were considered really faddish in the teens, and they didn't. A reporter wouldn't jot down every word that you said. They would just kind of take it and run with it and make it as sort of colorful as they could. There was also this very sensational murder trial for Harry Thaw that gets mentioned in the excerpt, and that was something where women reporters weren't allowed to actually. Women weren't allowed in the courtroom, and the judge banned all women from the courtroom except for these 4 reporters who were allowed to stay in and report what was going on because the trial given by the defendant's wife was considered too sensational for women to hear directly. So it has a very strong historical storyline, and it's really grounded in events that took place on real days. And I guess, so it starts on July 5th, 1915, and it ends on a very specific date in July, and then there's an epilogue later. But the history isn't just the backdrop for the action, it's central to the plot.
Right. Well, do you remember the original idea or impetus for your novel, A Front Page Affair, and your heroine, Kitty Weeks?
Yeah, I was doing a PhD at Duke and I was working on silent films. And while I was doing my research, I learned about all the women who directed films back in the 1900s and 1910s. And that amazed me because there were so many of them. And I learned that, those types of numbers weren't seen again in the industry till the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s. So it fell off in the 20s and then didn't really recover the number of women making films until the 70s. And then I also learned about these early action films that were made with women heroines. And they were all the rage in the teens. So you have movies like The Perils of Pauline, The Exploits of Elaine, Perils of Our Girl Reporters. And they all had these women protagonists who were just doing everything. There's one, The Hazards of Helen, where you see Helen jumping onto a moving train and battling these bandits who stole. She's a telegraph operator who stole from the railways, and she defeats them and she gets her job back and things like that. I mean, very active. They're brandishing guns, and I was like, what is going on here? And why do more people not know about these women and the things that were going on at the time? And that's when I began to be more interested in the period and started looking into it further, and then realized how much also the U.S. was changing at that time. And then I really thought, I want to write something set in this period, but what kind of heroine do I need? At first I thought, maybe I would make her a film actress herself, but then I thought that I realized it might be a little limiting. So I came up with this idea of having her be a journalist, which is another kind of, in fact, women journalists were the heroines of many of these action films because they get to go out in the world and ask questions and do things. And so that's really where the idea came from.
That's really interesting. You mentioned about the historical, the historical setting, and you've talked about that and talked about, how the novel opens on a specific date and ends on a specific date. So I wonder, what was your research process like to research the book, given that it was, given that you've stuck so close to the historical record?
Well, yeah, so the process was really a lot of fun. I mean, first I did some sort of broad things, and I kept just sort of reading around in the period until I found an incident that really interested me, which was this shooting, this man. And again, these are these events, and I try to find events that are not so well known, but I think are very telling. So this man burst into J.P. Morgan's home on Long Island, and basically attacked him, shot him in the leg twice. And he comes in at breakfast. Morgan is sitting there with his wife and the British ambassador. They're all having breakfast, and this man charges in. They actually met on the first floor landing, and then Morgan was so angry, he ran towards the guy. The guy shoots him, and then Morgan fell on top of him. And J.P. Morgan was a very big man, 250 pounds, so he pins his scrawny attacker under him, although he's fallen down with bullet wounds. And then his wife yanks away a pistol, and the butler conks the guy on the head with a piece of coal. And this is all true. And I was like, this is crazy. So, I mean, I found this incident that interested me, and then what I do and what I've done, I just handed in a draft for book 2, is I go through the papers, which is every day over that period. And I know what happened, what the headlines were for the day every day. And then I kind of sketch out the events of the story. So it's Kitty the plot of the story I kind of insert it into the framework of what history gives me, sort of day by day. And I like to have her reacting to those type of things that are really happening in real life on a daily basis as they kind of unfold. And I'm also very careful not to change dates and things to suit the convenience of my story. And one thing, that's a small point, but July 4th in 1915 fell on a Sunday. there were no parties. There were no July 4th parties, private parties, really, large ones. They didn't do that kind of thing on a Sunday. So the July 4th parties, the big private ones, were all held on July 5th. And my story opens with this. And it would have been so much easier to say it's a July 4th party on July 4th. But I stuck to it's actually on July 5th because that's how it was. And it was really interesting because Morgan got shot on July 3rd, on the Saturday, and they reported it on the papers on July 4th. But then the parties actually happened on July 5th. So, but I kind of take notes and write down what's happening, the main stories for every day of the period, and then kind of work from there.
That's interesting. So I'm also curious. You mentioned that you first got interested in this period when you were doing this PhD and studying silent films. I'm curious, were you a mystery fan or a fan of historical mysteries, or was there ever a process where you considered writing a more literary novel set in this period? What was your decision or thinking when you decided to kind of basically tackle a historical mystery series?
Well, I love mysteries. I always read. I think I must have grown up reading Agatha Christie, and then there's another writer who I really like, who isn't so well known here. I think Dick Francis. He's British. Do you know him?
Yes.
Yeah. So he's the horse racing guy, and
exactly.
I used to love. Right. So I used to love reading his books, and I had no interest in horse racing. I knew nothing about it, but you would just like turn. It's like these page turner books, and you end up learning so much about a whole different world, and it gave me the sense that mystery is such a great genre because it's all about discovering the truth, right? Who killed someone, but along the way you're discovering all these other things. And so for me, it is like a storytelling. First of all, it has a beginning, middle, and an end, which I like, and it also is about discovery. So I feel like it really goes well with like opening up a whole new world, and you can do it in a very easy kind of readable way. Like I really don't. I don't like to get bogged down in things.
Right.
So I just felt like it worked very well.
So had you written fiction before you sat down to write this novel?
No, I had not. And I had tried my hand at screenplays a bit, but then when I kind of set on this story, I really felt like I needed to be able to write it as a novel because there was just too much there for me to try to do it as a screenplay, but it took a very long time. I kept thinking that I couldn't write a novel, so I wrote a version of it that was really short, and then I was like, and I showed it to some people, and they said, "Oh, this is great." And then I, worked to make it bigger, and then I actually had written an earlier version of the book that is now in a drawer, but with Kitty and her, the same characters that appear in Front Page Affair, but set in 1914. And so I really learned by doing, I would say. It took me several years.
And what was the process like once you had a draft that you were happy with in terms of finding a publisher?
So once I had a draft that I was happy with, I started to look for an agent, and I had not really gone to any writing work. I mean, I showed it to people who I knew who were in publishing or were writers themselves for feedback, but I never joined any formal group. I never went to any conferences or anything like that. I think I was kind of I was worried about sort of being overwhelmed if I saw the reality of how hard it was when if I saw like a huge hotel or something filled with all these people pitching, I would be so discouraged at my chances that I would just stop. So I think artificially protected myself. I mean, I knew that it's very hard, but I tried not to face it for as long as possible. And then I started writing, just query letters to agents, some of whom were recommended to me. And I tried to also, people said, and I think this was very good advice, try to find a book that's similar to yours and query the agent that represents that book. For me, the tricky part was trying to figure what that meant. I was like, how similar? New York historical similar, style similar, length similar. And that actually took me a bit of time until finally a friend said, no, it's, protagonist, period. You have to be don't be creative when thinking about similar.
Right.
Go very similar. So and in the end, that's how I found my agent. I queried the agency that represented a writer whose work was similar to mine, and they were interested, and we went from there.
Do you mind mentioning who the writer was?
Yeah, actually, it's Rhys Bowen.
Oh, okay. Great. So, given your success to date with getting the series published, and you just mentioned, obviously your debut novel is out, which we've been talking about, and you said that you turned in the draft for the second novel. Given your success to date, what advice would you have for aspiring writers who might be listening and are interested in writing their own novels or short stories?
Well, I think the most important thing is to finish what you're doing. So I think it's very easy to have that unfinished manuscript in your drawer and be too nervous to show it to people, or too nervous, actually, I think, to finish. That was for me the hardest struggle, to say, okay, I've done the best that I can do. Now I really need to try showing it to other people. So I think whatever it takes for each individual person. Some people like to work in a group. Some people like to work alone. I think that you have to figure out for yourself. But I would say finish it, and then don't be discouraged. Like, show it out. If you have enough friends and people whose opinion you trust, who tell you that it's basically a good book and ready to go out there, then ask for query agents, find an agent, and it's not all about connections, because I found my agent really through a cold letter that I wrote. So it does happen, and I think it just requires patience, and I think it requires really figuring out, taking a step back and figuring out where your book fits into the market. And that's difficult to do. And I wouldn't even recommend trying to do that while you're writing. I think when you're writing, you should just write the book you want to write. And then afterwards, it may take you some time, but you figure that out. And you just, I think, stick with it. Like, it's perseverance also in the end.
Sure. So are there books and authors that inspire your own writing, either books that you've read in the past or books that you've read recently?
Yeah. I love Doctorow, and especially he has this wonderful book on New York waterworks. I think that for me, that was terrific. Actually, in a funny way, in terms of the series, what has inspired me most is TV. And I like series like The Wire, where they, it's totally different in feel to what I've done. But I really like that concept of where, over the course of the series, you see Baltimore from various different angles, and you kind of get the sense of how the city operates, and you keep coming back and meeting these characters again and again, like they may disappear, but then they'll come back later. And you get this sense of a full and complete world. That's kind of, for me, that's really the inspiration for what I'm trying to do with this series, which is that over the course of it, here you're moving through time more than through space. But you're moving through time. You're moving through New York City over these 5, 6 very transformational years, and you're getting a sense of how society and politics and everything was changing. And I introduce historical figures in the book, and they'll come and go. I hope to have some film actors also in there as well. but also just, important figures of the day make an appearance. And because Kitty's a journalist, she gets to speak to them, which is also fun.
That's great. So have you projected the number of books for the series?
I haven't projected the number of books exactly. I think, you take it one step at a time, but I kind of have thought about it. I would say, so I finished the second book and I have thoughts for the third. So I have like a very vague idea of the arc of it, but I, haven't projected out in so many.
Sure.
But I think it also helps to, if you want to write a series, to definitely have an arc in mind.
Right. So are there other time periods that you've thought in the back of your mind? I mean, obviously you're hard at work on the series, but are there other historical time periods that appeal to you maybe down the road for another series?
I think so. I haven't really thought about them very much. I mean, I think, the teens are so, they're just so jam-packed with things going on. And what was also interesting to me as I was doing my writing is I don't think there's actually that much fiction or that much, and even that much like popular culture movies or anything set in this particular period that I'm doing. It's either afterwards in the 20s with, the roaring 20s and the jazz era and everything already looks modern, or it's a little earlier. So you get more of the turn of the century or the early 1900s, 1910, with more Vanderbilts, Astors, and, the big money, the robber barons. But this transitional moment where the country goes from being Victorian to modern doesn't feel so covered to me, so that it feels like there's a lot to say, and more also like the stuff that's on it is set in Europe on the battlefields and so on and so forth. But the American perspective, the domestic perspective, I just feel like there's just not that much out there. So I feel there's a lot for me to write about, whereas many of the other 20th century decades I feel are much better covered.
Right. Well, where can people find you online to learn more about you and your books?
So you can go to my website, which is www.radhavatsal.com, and it's RADHAVATSAL. But you can also find me on Facebook. You can friend me on Facebook, and I have a Tumblr, actually, for if you're interested in ephemera from the 1910s. As I said, this is a very heavily researched book, so the apartment building, for instance, that Kitty lives in, that's a real apartment building that existed and still exists in Manhattan, and I found her original floor plans, and there's just all kinds of details about roads, streets, events, people from the teens, and that's on a Tumblr. It's called The World of Kitty Weeks, and you can also find me on Goodreads.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Radha Vatsal, author of the new historical mystery novel, A Front Page Affair. The book is in bookstores now, so go buy a copy. And Radha, thanks for doing this interview.
Thank you.
Here's to getting back together, to planned lunches and unplanned cookouts, to grandma's recipes and smells that take us back, to passing down plates and traditions. Here's to warm embraces and familiar faces, to your best friends becoming best friends, to scheming, dreaming, and food still steaming. Here's to laughter and love, to growing closer than ever. For all of life's get-togethers, Chinette, here's to us.
For the ones going above and beyond. For the ones reaching out, helping out, and lending a hand. For the ones people count on. You can count on Grainger. Grainger offers supplies and solutions for every industry. Backed by 24/7 customer support and specialists to help with hard-to-find products. Because you've got everyone's back. We've got yours. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.